They called it Canada's $34 billion tunnel to nowhere. Critics pushed back hard. Protesters marched. The world watched skeptically as Canada decided to punch a hole straight through a mountain just to move more oil. But here's the part most people didn't expect. 1 year later, early results were defying the worst predictions. The project many dismissed as financial madness was showing signs of becoming a strategic asset that shifted Canada's position in global energy markets. So what really happened when Canada bet everything on boring through solid rock? And why are some former opponents now reconsidering their stance on this controversial pipeline? Let's dive into one of the most dramatic infrastructure stories in Canadian history. Picture this. It's 1953, and welding teams are working around the clock, laying down 1,150 kilometers of steel from Edmonton to Burnaby. This wasn't just engineering, it was a declaration. Canada was done being caught short on fuel during wartime. That original Trans Mountain pipeline moved 150,000 barrels a day when it launched, doubling by the 1980s. Jet fuel flowed to Seattle. West Coast refineries stayed well fed. It worked for a while. Then Alberta's oil production didn't just grow, it surged. By 2010, the province was pumping out roughly 2.7 million barrels daily, climbing toward 4 million by the early 2000s. But here's the problem. Nearly all of that oil had limited export routes, with the vast majority flowing south into the U.S. Value drained away. Rail cars packed with crude limped along congested routes. The old pipeline maxed out completely. Alberta producers watched as their oil sold at steep discounts, the gap between Western Canada Select and the U.S. benchmark fluctuating wildly, sometimes spiking to more than $40 below WTI, averaging painfully wide for extended stretches. People began asking the hard question: was Alberta's resource wealth trapped? That's when the TMX twinning plan surfaced. Not a repair job, a full-scale expansion. Engineers mapped out a 1,000-kilometer steel shadow running parallel to the original line. But there was one massive obstacle: Burnaby Mountain. Their solution? Cut straight through it. Drill a tunnel wide enough to fit a subway train using a tunnel boring machine roughly the length of a blue whale. And that wasn't all. The plan called for dozens of trenchless crossings, slipping pipes under rivers, railways, and major highways without open trenching. It was surgical precision. Millions of cubic feet of earth had to be displaced while minimizing disruption to surrounding neighborhoods. Noise barriers went up. Water systems managed dust. Light shields reduced nighttime glare. The engineering earned respect even from opponents, but admiration for the drilling didn't silence the deeper objections. When Kinder Morgan first filed for the pipeline expansion in 2013, the budget sat at 6.8 billion Canadian dollars. Manageable, straightforward. Then reality intervened. By 2018, with political tension rising and Kinder Morgan losing confidence in the regulatory environment, Ottawa stepped in and bought the entire Trans Mountain project for 4.7 billion Canadian dollars. The justification? Preserving a project deemed to be in the national interest. But what followed tested even optimists. By 2020, costs had ballooned to 12.6 billion Canadian. In 2022, 21.4 billion Canadian. And by the time oil finally flowed through those pipes in 2024, 34 billion Canadian dollars. 5 times the original estimate. Finance commentators shredded the numbers. Memes showed the pipeline wrapped in $100 bills. Editorial cartoonists had a field day. The project became shorthand for government cost overruns. So what drove the escalation? It wasn't a single failure, it was a cascade. The pandemic turned supply chains into bottlenecks. Steel prices surged. Challenging geology near Kamloops chewed through drill bits. Landowners demanded reroutes. 2 wildfire seasons forced work stoppages and firefighting responses in project zones. Then came insurance hikes, court challenges, regulatory delays, labor shortages in specialized trades. On paper, it looked like a project spiraling out of control. Critics argued, with real justification, that Canadian taxpayers might never recover the money. But in the background, federal economists were working a different set of calculations. A 2023 analysis by Ernst & Young estimated TMX could contribute approximately 9.2 billion Canadian to GDP and generate around 2.8 billion Canadian in government tax revenue through 2043. The Bank of Canada incorporated modest GDP growth assumptions tied to the expansion into its 2024 outlook. These projections depend on sustained oil demand, stable pricing, and continued Asian market access, none of which is guaranteed. The honest answer is that the full return on investment won't be clear for years. But the strategic argument was never purely about direct payback. It was about leverage, moving Alberta's oil from a captive discount market to opposition to Trans Mountain was never simply mockery or ignorance. The strongest critics raised substantive concerns that remain relevant even after oil began flowing. Protest camps formed along the route. Courtrooms processed a steady stream of injunctions and appeals, and the numbers behind some concerns were genuinely alarming. A roughly 7-fold increase in tanker traffic through the Salish Sea and Burrard Inlet. Environmental groups focused on the southern resident killer whale population, critically endangered, with numbers hovering around 73 to 75 individuals during the planning years. Marine biologists presented research showing that increased vessel noise could interfere with echolocation, the primary hunting mechanism for these orcas. The concern wasn't hypothetical. Peer-reviewed studies documented behavioral disruption from ship traffic. Ottawa declined emergency protection orders, offering instead a framework described as adaptive management, essentially monitoring and adjusting over time. Critics saw this as deferring hard decisions. Supporters argued it was the only practical approach given scientific uncertainty about precise impact thresholds. Indigenous nations mounted the most legally and morally significant opposition. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation, Coldwater Indian Band, Squamish Nation, and others raised a foundational issue. Much of the route crossed unceded territory, and meaningful consent had not been obtained. This wasn't simply protest, it was rooted in constitutionally protected rights and in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada formally endorsed. Courts repeatedly found that the federal government's initial consultation processes were inadequate, forcing restarts and delays that added years and billions to the project. Some institutional investors joined the opposition, arguing that TMX represented stranded asset risk in a world transitioning away from fossil fuels. Several major pension funds and European investment houses flagged the project as potentially incompatible with Paris Agreement commitments. These weren't fringe positions. They reflected genuine tension between short-term resource economics and long-term climate commitments that Canada has made on the international stage. The climate argument deserves direct engagement. The script would be dishonest if it ignored the central criticism. Expanding pipeline capacity enables production growth, which increases total emissions from extraction through end-use combustion. Per-barrel transport emissions drop when crude moves by pipeline instead of rail. Industry estimates suggest reductions of roughly 60 to 70% for the transportation segment specifically. But this savings is dwarfed by the emissions enabled by higher total throughput over decades. Proponents counter that global oil demand persists regardless of Canadian supply decisions, and that displacing heavier emitting competitors actually improves the global emissions picture. This argument has some economic logic, but remains contested among climate scientists and energy economists. In 2020, the Supreme Court of Canada declined to hear further appeals after the federal government completed a revised consultation process. The legal path cleared, though not everyone agreed the underlying issues had been resolved. Construction proceeded at full scale. In the early morning hours of May 1, 2024, inside a control room in Edmonton, operators initiated the startup sequence for the expanded Trans Mountain system. Valves opened along the line, Digital monitoring systems confirmed pressure building smoothly through each segment. Minutes later, diluted bitumen, heavy, viscous, and dark, began moving through the new twinned pipeline toward the British Columbia coast. The Trans Mountain expansion was no longer a blueprint, a court battle, or a budget line. It was operational. Relief rippled through control rooms from Alberta to the coast. Engineers and technicians who had spent years navigating construction challenges watched the system perform as designed. The startup came in ahead of the most recent revised schedule, a rare bright spot in a project defined by delays. Within the first week, a tanker docked at the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby. Loading arms connected, and crude began flowing aboard for export to an Asian refinery. It was a milestone. Alberta heavy crude heading directly to Pacific markets at meaningful scale for the first time. Verification of specific vessel names, exact loading volumes, and precise destination refineries from the initial shipments should be confirmed against Trans Mountain Corporation's public disclosures and Port Authority records. Early reporting indicated China, South Korea, and India as primary initial destinations. Pipeline economics usually sound dry until you realize they ripple into provincial budgets, employment numbers, and the price gap that determines whether Alberta's oil industry thrives or bleeds. Here's the core mechanism. For every dollar that the spread between Western Canada Select and the U.S. benchmark narrows, Alberta collects substantially higher royalties. Industry estimates suggest the sensitivity is roughly 200 to 250 million Canadian dollars annually per dollar of spread narrowing, depending on production volumes and royalty framework assumptions. After TMX became operational, the WCS discount did narrow. Early data suggested improvement of several dollars per barrel, though the discount fluctuates based on many factors beyond pipeline capacity, including refinery demand, seasonal maintenance, and global crude quality preferences. Attributing all spread improvement to TMX alone would be an oversimplification. But additional egress capacity was clearly a contributing factor, and one that market analysts had long identified as the most direct lever available. Before TMX, Canada was moving roughly 150,000 to 200,000 barrels a day by rail to reach non-U.S. markets or to bypass pipeline constraints. Rail transport cost producers an estimated 10 to 15 Canadian dollars more per barrel than pipeline, depending on distance and market conditions. Shifting volume from rail to pipe keeps that differential in producers' pockets rather than paying it out in transport premiums. The carbon comparison requires honest framing. Per-barrel transportation emissions are indeed significantly lower for pipelines than for rail. Industry and government figures suggest 60 to 70% reductions for the transport segment. However, this addresses only the movement of oil, not the extraction or combustion emissions that represent the vast majority of life cycle carbon output. Citing transport savings as a climate argument for the pipeline is accurate in a narrow sense, but misleading if presented as the full emissions picture. Asian markets responded to the new supply route. China, South Korea, India, and other Pacific Rim buyers began contracting for Canadian heavy crude. Exact import volumes by country for late 2024 and early 2025 are still being compiled by agencies like the Canada Energy Regulator, and early figures should be treated as preliminary. What is clear is that Canada's buyer base diversified meaningfully. Where once the United States was essentially the sole customer for Alberta crude, Pacific markets now represent a growing share. This diversification proved its value quickly. In early 2025, trade tensions between Canada and the United States, including tariff threats, highlighted the risk of depending on a single export market. TMX provided exactly the kind of optionality that advocates had argued for. The opportunity cost question matters. 34 billion Canadian dollars is an enormous public investment. Whether that capital would have generated comparable or superior returns invested in renewable energy infrastructure, transit systems, or direct economic diversification programs is a legitimate question that this narrative cannot resolve. Different economists reach different conclusions depending on assumptions about oil prices, demand trajectories, and discount rates. Honest analysis requires acknowledging this debate rather than treating the economic case as settled. By spring 2025, the expanded Trans Mountain system was operating at a substantial portion of its nameplate capacity of approximately 890,000 barrels per day. Utilization rates ramped up through the first year as shippers filled contracted capacity. Financial coverage shifted tone. Publications that had written the project off began running reassessments, noting stronger than expected throughput and market uptake. Tanker traffic at the Westridge Marine Terminal increased significantly, though exact monthly departure figures should be confirmed against Port Authority and Trans Mountain Corporation reporting. Public opinion stabilized. Polling by Angus Reid showed national support near 51% versus 36% opposed, the narrowest gap in years, with the remainder undecided. Notably, support remained regionally polarized, with Alberta and Saskatchewan strongly favorable, and British Columbia's lower mainland remaining deeply skeptical. Opposition persisted among coastal communities focused on marine spill risk, tanker traffic impacts, and the broader climate implications of expanded fossil fuel export capacity. These concerns did not disappear because the pipeline was operational. On the spill record, early operational data showed no major spill incidents during the first year. This is encouraging, but must be understood in context. Pipeline spill risk is a long-term statistical question, not one resolved by a single year of operation. The original Trans Mountain system has experienced spills over its 7 decades of operation, including notable incidents. Sustained safety requires ongoing investment in monitoring, maintenance, and emergency response, permanently. On killer whales, 1 year is insufficient to assess long-term impacts on southern resident orca populations. Mandatory speed restrictions for tankers, 11 knots through sensitive areas, and double hull requirements represent meaningful mitigation, but marine biologists emphasize that population recovery depends on multiple factors, including prey availability, contaminant levels, and cumulative noise exposure over years and decades. Indigenous participation evolved in significant and complex ways. More than 20 Indigenous communities entered or advanced equity discussions, potentially worth up to 30% of project value, a multi-billion-dollar stake that could represent one of the largest Indigenous-led infrastructure investments in Canadian history. This development is genuinely significant, but should not be presented as proof that opposition was wrong. Communities that pursued economic participation did so for their own strategic reasons, and many maintained that the consultation process was flawed. Other Indigenous nations continued to oppose the project entirely. The Indigenous response to TMX was never monolithic, and framing it as a simple arc from opposition to acceptance misrepresents the reality. In early 2025, Trans Mountain Corporation outlined plans to increase throughput without building new pipeline segments. The approach involves polymer drag-reducing agents injected into the crude stream, upgraded pump impellers, and additional intermediate pump stations along the existing route. The goal is to raise average line pressure and flow rates sufficiently to add up to 300,000 barrels per day, potentially pushing total system capacity toward 1.19 million barrels daily. Because the plan uses existing pipeline infrastructure, it avoids new trenching, new rights-of-way acquisition, and the associated environmental and stakeholder challenges that made the original expansion so contentious. Early engineering models suggest the upgrade could come online by late 2028 or early 2029, roughly aligned with forecasted growth in Alberta production. Capital costs are estimated well under 3 billion Canadian dollars, a fraction of the original expansion cost. However, regulatory approval is not guaranteed. The Canada Energy Regulator will evaluate the proposal, and public comment periods will invite renewed debate about capacity expansion, tanker traffic increases, and climate implications. Stakeholder fatigue is real, but so is stakeholder vigilance. If approved and executed, the optimization would position Canada's Pacific export capacity competitively against Latin American
and Middle Eastern suppliers serving Asian refineries.
The Trans Mountain expansion is operational and generating revenue. Early performance metrics have exceeded many pessimistic projections. But declaring victory after 1 year would be as premature as declaring failure was during construction. Several fundamental questions remain open. Will global oil demand sustain current levels through TMX's economic life? The International Energy Agency's projections suggest global oil demand could plateau in the late 2020s and decline through the 2030s under current policy trajectories. If demand contracts faster than expected, TMX toll revenues could fall below the levels needed to justify the investment. Conversely, if energy transition proceeds more slowly, as some analysts predict, the pipeline's value extends. Will the $34 billion investment generate a genuine return for Canadian taxpayers? This depends on toll revenue, operational costs, eventual sale price if privatized, and the counterfactual of what else that capital could have funded. The Ernst & Young projections are credible, but built on assumptions that may or may not hold. The honest answer is that we will not know for at least a decade. Will spill prevention hold over decades of operation? 1 clean year is a start, not a guarantee. Pipeline integrity is a function of ongoing maintenance investment, corrosion monitoring, and emergency preparedness. The original Trans Mountain line experienced multiple spill incidents over its lifetime. Long-term vigilance is non-negotiable. Will Indigenous equity participation actually materialize at meaningful scale? Discussions are promising, but not concluded. The difference between a memorandum of understanding and a signed equity agreement with revenue flowing to communities is enormous. If this succeeds, it could set a precedent for resource development across Canada. If it stalls, it becomes another unfulfilled promise. Does expanded fossil fuel export infrastructure conflict with Canada's climate commitments? This is perhaps the most fundamental unresolved tension. Canada has committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and has signed international agreements reflecting that goal. Building infrastructure designed to operate for 40 to 50 years and predicated on sustained or growing oil production creates an inherent tension with those commitments. Proponents argue the two can coexist through carbon capture, methane reduction, and offset mechanisms. Critics argue the math simply doesn't work. This debate is far from settled. So, was the mountain worth cutting through? The early evidence suggests the strategic case was sound. Canada needed export diversification. Alberta producers needed relief from chronic price discounts. The country needed leverage against trade dependency on a single buyer. TMX addresses all three. The financial case is less clear. $34 billion is an extraordinary sum, and whether the returns justify the investment, especially compared with alternative uses of that capital, remains genuinely debatable. Early revenue figures are encouraging, but not conclusive. The environmental and rights-based objections have not been invalidated by the pipeline's commercial performance. A project can be economically successful and still raise legitimate questions about ecological risk, climate compatibility, and the adequacy of consent processes. These things are not mutually exclusive. What Trans Mountain has demonstrated, perhaps above all, is the sheer difficulty of building major infrastructure in a democracy with competing interests, constitutionally protected rights, and genuine scientific uncertainty. The project was delayed, litigated, protested, nationalized, and inflated to 5 times its original cost, and it still got built and became operational. Whether that represents democratic resilience or democratic dysfunction depends on your values and your priorities. The next decade will deliver the real verdict. Oil markets, climate policy, spill records, Indigenous equity outcomes, and toll revenues will collectively determine whether TMX was a far-sighted investment or an expensive monument to a passing era. For now, the pipe hums. Oil flows west. Asian buyers diversify their supply. Alberta producers breathe a little easier. Coastal communities watch the tankers and hope the safety systems hold. And Canada navigates the uncomfortable space between resource economy and climate ambition, as it has for decades and as it will for years to come. So where do you land on the Trans Mountain expansion? Strategic necessity? Costly gamble? Environmental risk? Or all of the above? I'm genuinely interested in your perspective, especially if you disagree with something in this video. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want more deep dives into the infrastructure and energy stories shaping the world, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.